Okay, so a short lecture on the reform movements within the medieval church. This is part of the transition from the early Middle Ages to the High Middle Ages. It had long been understood, generally by people, that the medieval church was pretty corrupt. Remember, we saw all of that medieval art where every hell scene had churchmen and especially monks down there burning in the flames, which means people understood that there were a lot of misbehaving monks and priests in their society. Well, in the early Middle Ages, they had their hands full just dealing with Vikings and other invasions and turmoil to really look inward and deal with this kind of thing. But as things start to settle down, and as pilgrimages begin to happen and people are traveling and there's more money, people moving around, along with a lot of other things, there's going to be some more time to pay attention to endemic problems in their society. And the church realizes this. It's going to begin with reform of the monasteries. In the first major reform movement will be called the Cluniac Reform, named after a monastery in southern France named Cluny. Now, most Western monasteries followed the Benedictine Rule, at least they were supposed to. The Benedictine Rule was fairly strict, but as we saw, also pretty watered down compared to the life of Anthony and the Desert Fathers. Even still, sticking just to the Benedictine level of discipline was difficult for a lot of monastic houses. And a lot of the problem is built into the nature of a feudal society. When functions of government are seen as personal property, personal things that are owned by those in charge, all kinds of trouble is going to ensue, as we've already seen. And here's another aspect of this. Monasteries have patrons. There is some rich military guy often that pays for the land and the support of these monks. And so the local duke that supports them thinks of the monastery as his monastery. And when the abbot dies, ideally, what the monks do internally is they all gather, the Holy Spirit descends upon them, and they all utter the name of the same monk at once, who is the most holy among them, and that's made the next abbot. It rarely ever worked out that way. Often there's a whole lot of political infighting on who's going to be the next abbot. And if the duke who supports your monastery has got 3 or 4 sons, and he needs to find positions for them and things for them to do in life, well, you know, the oldest son's going to be the next duke. The next son will probably go into the church, become a bishop. And then you got those 3rd and 4th sons to worry about. So maybe one will go off on crusade eventually when those start and take care of them. Maybe they'll go, find their own way in life, but you got to find positions for them. And monasteries are wealthy and powerful positions. They control a lot of land. Monks might take individual vows of poverty, but monasteries as a whole have what we would call today corporate wealth, like the CEO that takes $1 a year in salary, but he has use of the corporate jet and the corporate limo and all the other perks going with the corporation. So the monasteries actually control a lot of wealth and privilege and themselves live very comfortably, even though they don't really own any of this stuff in theory. So maybe that 3rd or 4th son of the duke just decides to appoint him the next abbot of your monastery. And so that's where a lot of these troubles begin. We end up having an abbot who is not really a committed monk. He's not really there because he's moved by the Spirit to take these monastic vows and follow Christ to be spiritual. He's just there because he needs something to be in charge of. And this guy has grown up hunting and hawking and chasing winches and stuff around the castle. He's not really interested in their rather pasty-faced lives. And of course, what's down there in the cellar but kegs of the best beer and wine brewed in the Middle Ages. So if the abbot is not going to be there to enforce the discipline of the monastery, the discipline will break down. And all those hard laboring monks are going to mostly decide, what the heck, let's crack open a keg of beer and have a party. So a lot of these monasteries became essentially medieval raves going on in the middle of the wilderness. And this problem goes back for centuries. The Venerable Bede, we have a letter surviving from him complaining about this other monastery down the road where the monks are totally misbehaved and drunk all the time. So there's finally going to be a reform movement, and it's going to happen when the French aristocrats, who are kind of sick of these monks being really just a leech on society and not really behaving the way they're supposed to and not battling demons and being warriors for Christ like they ought to be, decide to step in and do something. And they begin by finding this monastery named Cluny, where the monks were very well disciplined. They followed the rule and they were models of sanctity. So the short of it is that Cluny is then put in charge of all of the other French monasteries. It becomes the mother house, and all the other monasteries become the daughter houses to Cluny. And Cluny then essentially starts doing the rounds. Their monks go out as inspectors doing surprise pop inspections on these monasteries to see if they're actually behaving themselves. And then they have to report back annually, and they have an annual meeting. The need to have a whole lot of Cluniac inspectors gathered together for the annual meeting also gives rise to a need to rebuild the monastery church at Cluny in a larger, grander fashion. It is one of the early churches that will employ the new Romanesque styles and stone architecture and vaulting. The original church is now gone, but we do have drawings of it, as you can see here. So this is going to be an early inspiration for Romanesque architecture, which we'll get back to in another talk. Anyway, these Cluniac reports about the bad behavior of monks do make for some pretty hilarious reading. They report back saying so many monks of this monastery were completely drunk. They didn't know the name of the monastery they were in. We visited this nunnery. The nun Alice was pregnant, obviously not following her vow of chastity, on and on it goes. So a whole lot of reports of misbehaving monks and nuns in the Middle Ages. So you're given a choice. You can either shape up and start following the rules of Benedict like you're supposed to, or you can leave and go find something else to do. And these monks don't have a whole lot of really marketable skills out in the real world. You can't just go start becoming a peasant farmer, or there's not really a whole lot of towns you can go find a place in yet. They maybe don't have any marketable skills. So they had to, most of them just knuckled under and started having to behave. By the end of the 10th century, monasteries had a much better reputation. The monks were behaving better, at least publicly, they're behaving better. And they had regained the respect of the general people. All right. So then the 11th century, it's time for the priesthood to also be reformed, because they too were kind of laughably corrupt by our standards today. Now, priests had always been, from the early Middle Ages, rather worldly political figures. They, controlled a lot of levers, mechanisms of government. They collected taxes. They controlled a lot of things. They did a lot of government functions. It was just a different world than we think of the priesthood today. Even so, you're supposed to have some modicum of sanctity in your behavior, and everybody knows that your local priest is down there at the local tavern getting drunk, chasing women, having mistresses, all that kind of stuff. So it's time for them to get reformed as well. And there's other issues as well. So the 11th century reform of the papacy of the priesthood is called the Gregorian Reform. It is named after the chief reformist pope, who was Gregory VII. Now, this is a much more complex kind of an issue, and we need to keep things simple here. So I just want to hit on three major elements that the Gregorian Reform will address. The first one is something that gets covered in Western Civ classes. Typically, and used to be a standard thing taught in high school history classes, although probably not so much recently. It's called the investiture controversy. And the issue comes down to who actually chooses the members of the church, the priests, the bishops especially, particularly in far-flung regions in the north of Europe. So to ask you about this, if the Bishop of Saxony in Germany were to die, should the Pope in Rome or the local aristocrat choose the next bishop? To your mind, the Pope in Rome ought to choose the bishops of his own church. That makes sense in the modern world when we have mass communication and it's, people can know what's going on in other parts of the world. In the Middle Ages, however, travel is slow and difficult. It might take a year for news of this dead bishop to get back to Rome, and another year for a messenger to get back with the new bishop. That's a couple of years of nobody running this important, governmental seat of power. And there's also this. The Pope in Rome doesn't know much of what's going on in northern Germany. He doesn't really know the political lay of the land. He has a very dim understanding of the real dynamics of political power. So how does he really know who to choose somebody that's going to be effective? Because these guys are political figures. They're not just churchmen. So there is an argument, at least in the Middle Ages, for the local duke to have a say in who's going to be the next bishop. It's got to be somebody that he can work with, somebody that speaks the local language and not just Italian and Latin. And so there's going to be a big fight about this. The climax of this battle is a famous scene in which Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII have been butting heads, and finally the Pope excommunicates the Holy Roman Emperor. which means that he cannot be given communion. His lands are put under interdict, which means that communion cannot be given to the populace, which makes the people nervous because by the 11th century, everybody is very thoroughly convinced that without that, you're going straight to hell. And it's just a way of kind of stirring up the populace against a political figure and just sort of maneuvering public sentiment against them. It's a very different world. In any case, the climactic scene happens at a castle called Canossa in northern Italy. It's a snowy winter. The Pope is staying there, and the emperor finds himself outside the walls of Canossa, barefoot in the snow, begging for forgiveness. And the Pope then, allows him to be forgiven. He lifts the excommunication, and on the surface, it looks like the church has totally won this battle. And this is considered an early conflict of church versus state that's going to go on for centuries in Western civilization. The real story is even more complex and not terribly interesting to people taking a medieval class for the first time, perhaps. But really, the emperor is manipulating the Pope as well. The Pope can't say no at this. The emperor gets the interdict lifted. He goes back and starts stirring up trouble again, and the conflict will go on. The end of this is going to be a compromise, essentially. When a bishop is given the symbols of his power, the ring that he wears and the staff, the crozier that he carries, which are public symbols that let people know that this guy has certain powers. Who gives him these powers is an indication of who in the feudal hierarchy that power flows down from. And the compromise is that the local aristocrat is going to give him one of the symbols and the church will give him the other symbol. And that way everybody sees that church and state have come to an agreement on who the next bishop of the town is going to be. Okay, that part is not terribly interesting for us. What is a little bit more interesting are the next two things. Thing number two, the Gregorian Reform. They outlaw clerical marriage. Now, a cleric is any member of the church. Anything from a local priest all the way up to the Pope. And if you are a cleric, that means you're a member of the clergy, a term we more closely associate with the church. And if you had been a monk, then you would have taken a vow of chastity, but clergymen did not have to do that. Surprising to many modern Catholics who have never met their priest's wife, because Catholic priests don't get married, they take a lifelong vow of celibacy, that was not always the case. For the first millennium of Christianity, priests were allowed to be married. Now, if they had high ambition and wanted to become a bishop and a cardinal and maybe become the Pope, they might make a big public display of chastity and show how spiritual and holy they were. And there are plenty of people that extol the virtues of perpetual virginity, but it wasn't illegal. In the 11th century, they're going to make it illegal for any member of the church to be married. Now, that might sound kind of strange. I mean, the Catholic Church is already a boys' club. Men run everything. Guys in the audience, can you imagine joining a club where men control everything that then passes a law saying that we will not have sex or get married anymore? That seems unlikely. Clearly, there's something else going on here behind the scenes. And what's really going on is this. Every other profession in medieval society, with the exception of monks, tend to have it set up where your son takes your place in the job. That's true for a shoemaker, for a mason, for the town blacksmith, and particularly in the north of Europe, for the priests. So local pastors, priests, their sons often took dad's place, which means that this very valuable bishopric, this ecclesiastical see, this geographical body where you raise taxes from and make money from, is starting to become an inheritance passed down, just like in feudal society, where dukes and kings pass down their titles and inheritance and privileges to their sons. Okay, again, that whole problem of a state versus a feudal society. When government is considered something owned privately, the privileges are owned by a person, then just like the medieval church, which is somewhat feudal, this is going to be the same problem. This is really the church trying to reach out and regain control over all the sources of wealth and power that it, in theory, is in charge of and manages, but in practice had become hereditary elements. So if you make it illegal for your priest to be married, that means he cannot have any legitimate sons. Remember, he had to be legitimate, born within marriage, in order to inherit in a society like this. So it may well be that the priests continued going down to the local brothel, but they could not be married anymore. Now, this was not an easy thing to institute. When they fasted, there was a lot of pushback from the priesthood, particularly the further north you go in Europe. Their wives were having protests and riots, and basically all these priests are being told to send your wife to a nunnery, dissolving their marriages, and that's it. It took a couple of generations to really push this through and enforce it, but eventually the church did. And to this day, priests cannot be married. Now, how do you sell this? What is the public way that you express the real reason for this? Simply talking about money and power isn't really good. Now, it's always about money and power, but that's not the propaganda you play. Instead, what we get are some sermons by reformist churchmen talking about why it is only appropriate for a priest to be celibate. And one of the most bizarre and extraordinary of these sermons comes from Pope Gregory VII's chief enforcer and right-hand man, a guy named Humbert of Silva Candida. Another medieval person you've never heard of before, but he's actually quite famous because it is he that goes to Constantinople in the 11th century, ostensibly to try to broker a reunion of the Latin and Greek churches and bring them together again. And when the Greek church told him, that his idea that the Pope in Rome is your boss and you should submit to him is not going to be accepted, and they tell him to go home, leaves a letter of excommunication, excommunicating the High Patriarch of Constantinople, and left it on the altar of Hagia Sophia, which is about the rudest thing a medieval churchman can do. This is the beginning of the Great Schism, the formal and official separation of Eastern and Western churches, which continues until today. So this is Humbert's personality. In any case, Humbert also has this sermon in which he explains why a priest ought not to be married. And he says that what it comes down to is this: the priests, when they conduct Mass, hold the Eucharist in their hands. Their fingers touch the precious flesh of Christ. Now remember, the laity, you did not take the Eucharist in your hand like you are able to do so today. You opened your mouth and the priest put it on your tongue and you ate it. You did not touch the thing, okay? Only the priest's fingers touch it. And Humbert says that it is vile, nasty, wicked, and disgusting for the same fingers that touch the Holy Eucharist, the flesh of Christ, to have been touching women's naughty bits the night before. So this is what sold it, basically, that women are so gross and disgusting that the priest's fingers that touch the Eucharist cannot touch them. So more fun medieval misogyny for you. In any case, this has led to a problem that is still persistent in the church today, because obviously priests are not going to just all stop having sex, which means it's going to be illicit sex, which means it's going to be, outside of canonical law, and is going to be the source of scandal. And so the church became very averse to these scandals and began hushing them up when it happened. Even worse is that priests who now have to basically not be around women and stuff, at least publicly. Also, we start to get more and more evidence of problems with priests committing sodomy, which is a medieval term, particularly with boys, which is not really homosexuality, but pederasty. So we know in the modern world that this scandal has exploded in the last few decades simply because we talk about sexual things more. Ever since the social revolutions of the 1960s, things that used to always be never mentioned and kept hidden and are just indecent for public discussion are now discussed publicly. Well, it's not that it's just recently started been going on. It's been going on since the Middle Ages, and we have plenty of documentary evidence at the time of the church hushing up these scandals. So the church inadvertently, in trying to basically create financial and power control over their realm and sell it using medieval misogynistic ideas about women, created the ideal environment for child abuse, for pederasts and child abusers to have free reign and a whole powerful institution to protect them. You'll find more and more published on this these days, but it's a perennial problem for the church. Now, whenever it comes up and some interviewer asks a churchman on TV, well, why can't a priest just get married? And You'll be able to fill these empty bishoprics and not have to try to find people willing to take a lifelong vow to not have sex with women that are also not going to have sex with anybody else. And the answer is always, well, a priest is married to the church. He's married to his vocation. It is, he doesn't want to have the distractions of a wife and children in a regular life. But that's bogus. That's complete nonsense. That's not the reason that they passed it, nor is it the justification for why they passed it. But nobody really wants to talk about historical realities today because it's an embarrassing thing. So if you happen to be Catholic and you're out there watching this, go do a little research. And when this comes up in your parish, maybe you can bring these historical realities to the fore. In any case, the result of this is going to be that no member of the church is going to be able to legally be married. And by the 12th century, once this is fully instituted, it's going to become a problem for a whole lot of people like Peter Abelard coming up in a future discussion. So we'll see. Speaking of Abelard, a radical scholar of the 12th century who's going to seriously shake up the world of thought, this leads us to the third of the reform movements, and that is education reform. In the early Middle Ages, when your laity that you were ministering to were all illiterate peasants, you could keep things pretty simple. In fact, you had to keep things simple. Peasants aren't going to understand Augustinian theological treatises. You really can't get into that kind of complexity. You keep it simple, right? So when you make peasant level versions of your theology, it's basically like you see in the art. When your soul is being weighed in the scales, what they learned is that your wealth and your status and your friends don't go with you on Judgment Day. It's only you and your good deeds weighed against your sins in the scales. So every time you sin, do 2 good deeds to balance it out and maybe give yourself a little extra so you pass on Judgment Day. Okay, that's peasant level theology in the early Middle Ages. And other little things like, counting your rosary beads, going to confession, that kind of stuff keeps it kind of simple. Well, by the 10th and 11th century, we have towns rising. We have people that are leaving peasant plantations, going to the city, getting a modicum of education, just becoming a little more worldly, just having more people to talk to, having more stimulus, more things to think about. And townspeople start asking more questions. They want to know more about this Christianity that their ancestors have been a part of for many, many centuries, but they've really never had time to think about and explore. And as they start asking more probing questions, the church finds that they've got to come up with some better answers. They've got to come up with more stuff to fill sermons. When you were a peasant, you maybe saw a priest, once a decade when they came around and did a big mass for everybody, a big mass baptism, and collected the names of the dead. If you were in a really, really rural place, you might not have had a churchman all that close by. But when you live in a city, you got the church right there. You go to church every week, maybe more than once a week. So you got to fill up these sermons with something, things that priests didn't have to worry about doing before. And people start asking questions. What does it really mean that Jesus was God and he was also man? And if he's God, why did he get killed horribly? Why didn't he save himself? All those kinds of questions start coming back up again. And so we're going to see the rise of a whole lot of extra biblical literature, stories about the childhood of Jesus and what he was like as a sweet little kid, and all kinds of miracle stories that are nowhere in the Bible, but the church has just got to come up with something to keep people entertained and engaged. Well, you're going to need better trained priests for this. They can't just go through the motions of a Latin mass anymore, give everybody a Jesus cookie and call it a day. But the problem is you got to train these people. And again, the whole thing about an ecclesiastical see, a priesthood being passed down, through the family and somewhere in northern England or Ireland or northern Germany, you might not have always had a well-trained priest. And so you might have a country priest that actually can't read Latin at all. They can't actually read the Bible. So how do you do mass? Well, remember, nobody read the Bible back then except for churchmen. So regular folks don't actually know what's in it. They just know certain stories that have always been told that are sort of popular tales about Jesus and the saints and the martyrs. And they know that when you go to mass, the priest says a bunch of stuff in a language you don't understand, and you know when to stand up, when to pray, when to sit down, and when to go up and get the Eucharist. But you don't really understand it. So if the priest's son never really learned his Latin and he takes over, who's going to know if he really is saying the words properly or not? He might be just kind of faking it from memory. In nomine Patri, Filii, Spiritus, Hippopotamus, amen. Who's going to question him? Well, we need better trained priests than that. So there's going to be a movement to train them better, to have better schools for priests. And so this is going to lead to the rise of a new kind of school. in medieval Europe, and probably something, much needed. Now, so far, we've looked at one kind of school in the early Middle Ages that were called monastic schools. We saw the little school on the St. Gall monastery plan. We know about how around Carolingian times, they realized that, Charlemagne and his, these guys, they rule an empire full of illiterate bumpkins. You need people that can at least have the basics of literacy. And so monastic schools were instructed, or monasteries were instructed to open little monastic schools where at least the children of the upper classes, the nobility that will be the future leaders of medieval society, can learn the basics. And what they learned there essentially was the 3 R's, as they used to say back in 19th century Americana: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Now, if English is your second language, that joke might not land with you. Obviously, reading, writing, and arithmetic begin with different letters. But if you say it like a 19th century bumpkin, reading, writing, and arithmetic, they all sound like they start with an R. It's an old Americana joke. Anyway, basically, how to read a little bit, how to add. And that way, when Charlemagne sends you orders to arrive on May 20th with 30 armed men to get ready for the year's battle, you know how to count to 30, you know how to read the instructions. All right, so that served in a Carolingian period in the early Middle Ages. Now we need better education. And they've been building all of these Romanesque cathedrals, all these pilgrimage churches, larger buildings, stone vaultings, big structures, expensive, time-consuming to make. Once you make a big old church like that, you don't just use it once or twice a week for a church service. You don't just use it for mass, you use it for everything. You have town meetings there. The habit of getting married on the front steps of the church will start to emerge among city folk. And they also have schools now taking place there. And many of these cathedrals had a monastery attached to it. There were monks that was just simply part of the whole church complex there. Towns had arisen around these monasteries and around these centers of ecclesiastical power. So we've got monks there, scholars, to teach classes, and we've got now a building to teach them in, so we call them cathedral schools. And the curriculum for the cathedral school is going to enlarge a bit. It's not going to just be the 3 R's now. It's going to be the full 7 liberal arts. Now, the 7 liberal arts go back to ancient Greek and Roman curricula. This is, if you were a freeborn citizen, if you were a standing figure in Greek, Athenian or Roman society, these are the things that free men studied, which is one theory of the origin of the word liberal arts, from the word libera, which means free, freedom, free thinking, or is it free people that studied it? People still debate actually what this origin is. Anyhow, the liberal arts are 7 in number, and they include the grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. So these are the 7 advanced subjects that scholarly people study. Now, these are divided into 2 groups. The first is the Trivium. You see the root word of tricycle there, the word 3. Via means way. So the threefold way, or the Trivium, is grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And then the Quadrivium, the fourfold way, are these other 4 studies. Take a look at what these 3 things have in common and what these 4 things have in common, and you can see the organizational scheme that's present there. You see it? This is about language arts and words. These are all mathematical things. Essentially, the 7 liberal arts are the study of letters and numbers. That's what distinguishes an educated person from an illiterate country farmer. You know what letters and numbers are. You know what those little scribbles on parchment mean. You can make sense out of this stuff. That's what makes you distinct and fairly rare in a medieval society like this. So cathedral schools are opened, and the original idea is that we're going to train people for the priesthood, to study high-level theology and to really understand all this stuff, because this is not the end of your education. Cathedral school was essential training, just to give you the rigors of intellectual discipline so that you could then go on to the higher level study at the university. And there are 3 university subjects one may go on and study that you need this initial intellectual training for. One of them, the church is concerned, is theology. The other 2 are still big money-making university degrees today, law and medicine. We always need doctors, we always have to endure lawyers, and all of them require advanced training for the sophisticated things that they have to study, right? So the cathedral school degree did not necessarily by itself take you to the front row in life. It did not get you the high-paying job. It was simply the rudiments to get you to the point where you can read difficult ancient texts in law, in medicine, in Augustinian theology, so that you could become a member of the church or a doctor or a lawyer who might also be working for the church, right? So what they were doing here is a whole lot like what you guys are doing right now. You are at a community college. You're at a 2-year college getting your AA degree. And your AA degree by itself is not really the ticket to a high-paying job. The function of your associate's degree is mostly to get you into the university, where you study the higher level stuff, where you'll focus on your major to get that degree that does, we hope, take you to a high-paying job. So you can think of these cathedral schools as kind of cathedral community college. And they were serving the same function in the High Middle Ages as they serve for you today. They help you escape your world of basic public education to get to a higher realm, to actually study and discipline your mind so that you can study and understand and comprehend really difficult things, and then go do a high-paying professional career-based job. So this is what you're doing now. Grammar, that's how to put words together into proper sentences where they make sense, right? Nowadays, you call that Comp 1. Logic, that's how you write in a way that supports an extended argument. Where do you write an extended argument research paper? Comp 2. Rhetoric, that's the art of persuasive speaking. You have to remember that back then, paper is almost non-existent. It's just starting to arrive in Europe. Parchment's very expensive, so you didn't do a whole lot of writing on things. You did a whole lot of work orally. Books are extremely expensive. You rarely own them. You rented them, or you borrowed them, or you studied them in a controlled library with a lot of security checks. There are libraries where the books are chained to the walls that you can't steal them. So in a world like this, a lot of work is done orally, which means you not only have to know your stuff, you have to be able to speak and communicate it effectively with certain rhetorical flourish, right? We still have a few words today that remind us of a time in which most business was done orally. When you go to trial and the evidence is presented, you don't read the evidence, it is spoken aloud. You're at a hearing. You hear the evidence spoken. When the tax man comes to make sure that you're not cheating on your taxes, what's happening? You're being audited. Audio. Tax records are read and heard aloud, and they make sure that you're paying properly. Right? So there's once a world in which this was, most business was done orally. You had to know how to speak effectively. And they spoke in rhetorical flourishes that we'd find kind of corny today, because most people can just read stuff for themselves. But we still have the relic of that world with us, that required speech class that you still have to take when you go to college. Now, the other level, the quadrivium, the mathematical stuff. In our modern world, we live in such an advanced mathematical scientific society that what passed for advanced mathematical studies for them is grade school math for you, okay? It's hard to imagine a world in which people had trouble with arithmetic, but in fact, this is an advanced study. So you were learning, how to do arithmetic in kindergarten or first grade. For them, it was much higher kind of a thing. Geometry, you probably took geometry in 8th or 9th grade, that Euclidean geometry that you found boring. Okay, well, scholars have spent centuries mastering how to use, ruler, square, and compass to perfectly create geometrical structures and understand and prove the theorems of them. This was very exciting intellectual horizons they were exploring back in the time. Astronomy is also very mathematical, mostly being able to follow the heavenly bodies, the planets and the stars. And for churchmen, this is important, particularly because there's a very important holiday every year in the Catholic Church that doesn't fall on the same date every year, and that's Easter. All of these feast days were set in the calendar, but Easter was called the movable feast because it's always got to be on a Sunday, but it's going to be on a different date every year. And use this very complex formula involving lunar calendars. And so I won't get into the details here, but you've got to know a little bit of astronomy to correctly calculate the correct date of Easter. And you cannot celebrate Easter on the wrong day, right? So they're still using a work written by the Venerable Bede back in the early 8th century. This work will be used for 600 years by the church to calculate the correct date of Easter. And it's pretty difficult stuff for them. So you need astronomy for that. As for music, they weren't taking guitar classes in these colleges. Music for them is Pythagorean harmonies, which you need to understand, to help write church hymns, but also because studying musical harmonies and ratios was just part of the somewhat mystical process by which you became attuned to the mysteries of God's universe. It helped elevate you spiritually to understand these sorts of things, all right? So these are the things that they will study in preparation for going on to a degree in theology, or perhaps out into the world with law and medicine. But what we'll find is that a lot of scholars came in and studied this and just became fascinated and engaged in study itself. They wanted to research and improve their knowledge of mathematics. They wanted to find out what more could be discovered. What more can we know about astronomy? What further mysteries are there to be found? And so cathedral schools became some of the first sort of research institutions, a very limited scale, yes, but they're simply fascinated by the study of knowledge itself and what can be learned. We're going to find basically the revival of learning for its own sake happening in these cathedral schools as the long-term result of the medieval reform of the church. And the first exciting example of this is going to happen in the late 11th century. There's going to be a little cathedral school in the north of France that is run by a scholar named Anselm of Bec. And Anselm of Bec has a bunch of theology students, and they're talking about biblical things and stuff. And then an event happens that is famous in the history of philosophy. If you take a history of philosophy class, this is the event that is referred to as the rebirth of philosophical questioning in the Western world. Remember that philosophy all began back with the ancient Greeks, and especially around Athens in the 6th century BC. And it lasted for over 1,000 years until the Emperor Justinian shut down all the philosophy schools in Athens. And so from 529 on, after this was shut down, the only real scholarship you had was Christian scholarship in the Western world. And it was not really committed to new discovery and exploration. It was committed to preserving the biblical knowledge in the church fathers while you waited for Jesus to return. But in the 11th century, some unknown student in the class of Anselm of Bec raised his hand and did something extraordinary. He asked an original question. And the question was, Master Anselm, is it possible to prove the existence of God by merely rational argument? Not that I'm doubting or anything, of course, but without just quoting the Bible and its obvious proof, can we just rationally make arguments to show that God must exist? So Anselm gave it some thought, and he came back with this explanation. He says, yes, to put it in simple terms, he says, God is the highest imaginable thing, of which nothing higher can be imagined. And what he means by this is that we think of the world in degrees of things: good, better, best, warm, hotter, hottest. God is the highest possible perfection, of which nothing higher can be imagined. And the very fact that you can think about that perfection when you are an imperfect little worm of a mortal means that that perfection must exist, or how could you even contemplate the very thing? All right. So he's channeling a bit of Plato in his answer. You might sort of recognize the sort of spiritual Neoplatonic hierarchy that he's sort of tapped into as a paradigm for his thinking. But what's most important about this is not his answer. It's the fact that, being pleased with his answer, he wrote a little treatise and he circulated it around to other scholars of his day. And he got a response. A monk named Guanilo, a name you will never hear again for the rest of your life, sent him a response. And Guanilo responds to Anselm and he says, oh, fascinating argument and all, yeah, but let me ask you this. Now I'm sitting here in my cold, northern, lonely monastery, and I'm imagining in my mind the most perfect possible island, of which no better island can exist. An island with cool breezes and warm sun, fruit, pretty island girls. Just because I'm imagining this island, does that mean it's real somewhere? Or is it just a figment of my imagination? Does your argument actually prove what you say it does? So he sends this around to all the same people. Now, Anselm got annoyed and wrote him a snippy little response and told him to watch his tongue. But other people read all this and they gave their answers to it. And then they added to the argument. And then other people added to that argument. And what happens is a philosophical discussion begins about the limits of reason. What can be known? What can the human mind comprehend? How does reason function? And 100 other questions spill out of this because one unknown student raised his hand and asked an original and probing question. So the revival of the philosophical tradition, the inquiry into knowledge for its own sake, will ultimately be the ultimate thing born out of this cathedral school, out of this medieval reform movement. In the 12th century, we're going to find radical scholars coming into these cathedral schools and really shaking things up. And by the end of the 12th, early 13th century, all of the translations of classical science and learning with all of the medieval Arabic additions to it, and Muslim scholars improved a lot of those classical sciences while they pursued them, particularly in Muslim Spain. All of that stuff is going to come back in translation due to the Reconquista and supercharge these schools with more learning than they can hardly wrap their heads around. And we're going to have a rich and vibrant intellectual tradition born in Europe once again.